Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Hidden Wild lesson for biology, starting off with food webs. So, we are touching on the standards SC 912L 17.9, which is using food webs, as well as 17.8, which is recognizing the consequences of biodiversity loss, specifically talking about introduction of invasive and non-native species. Moving forward, the main objectives being touched upon in this lesson is describe the different roles of producers, consumers, and decomposers in different ecosystems, discuss the interactions among organisms in a food web, trace the movement of energy through various trophic levels in an ecosystem, and explain why the 10% of energy in a trophic level is available to the next level, and lastly, identify consequences and predict impact on ecosystems that result in a reduction of biodiversity. We're working with a 5E model. So starting off with our engage, we're going to watch the first clip of the film. Expected time is about 10 minutes of the film. While students are watching the film, if you could have them take notes, either physical on Post-its or mental notes on the different organisms that they see. It's important to note when you describe an organism that it's not only the animals, but also the other organisms within the film. So if they can remember any tree species names, any bushes that they can recognize, that would be very helpful when computing our food webs. So after they watch the clip, they can talk with their neighbor in pairs to try to classify each type of organism. So this is when we just kind of touched upon those plant species and putting them into different categories. So a producer, a consumer, a decomposer, is it an autotroph or a heterotroph, perhaps a herbivore or a carnivore? And then as a whole group, we're going to organize and group those organisms based upon our classifications. So this is where it would be useful if they wrote those on Post-it notes. You can divide a whiteboard into different sections, or you can use flip chart paper. You may also need to remind students what the roles of producers, consumers, and decomposers are. Moving on to our Explore tab. So in small groups, they are going to obtain a species list, which is found on the food web, both the digital version and the paper version. Or you can give them the species profile available in PDF. So they need to look through the list and either research or look at the profiles and determine within their ecosystem, is there a specific organism a producer, consumer, decomposer, etc. So by identifying what type of organism they have, it make them a little bit easier to fill out their food web. So now this is what the food web looks like. This is available in both a digital and a paper copy. For the paper copy, we're just going to look at it lists all organisms, and then they could write the specific notes. So this is where they would write what type of organism it is. If they're using the digital version, which I'm going to pop up, same kind of format, so they can list within the notes what type of organism that they believe it is. All these organisms are also listed on slide number 2 on the left-hand side, and they could also begin to color code them as a producer, herbivore, omnivore, carnivore, decomposer, based upon that species list or their research. Depending upon if students are researching or if you have given them the species profile, it changes the expected time frame. You can also have an extension and have groups share their food webs with the class or present them on a large flip chart paper. Within the teacher copy, it kind of shows a sample food web. The food webs, as we know, look very disorganized since not as simple as a food chain. Moving on to the explain, students identify 2 food chains from a completed food web that either has 3 or 4 organisms. So this is important when we talk about our ecological pyramids. It's important for students to note that producers are found in both the beginning of the food webs. And then they're going to trace the movement of energy through the trophic levels in an ecosystem and kind of go over some background information about the 10% rule. Continuing on with explain, this is displaying the digital copy. Students can work on a paper copy on a plain sheet of white paper or notebook paper. They are going to use the 3rd level consumer food chain to build an ecological pyramid. You might have to provide some additional background information about ecological pyramids and the 10% rule. Students should be familiar with recognizing that as they move up in the period, not only does the amount of energy passing on to the next level decrease, but also the number of organisms decreases as well. For our elaborate, there are different assigned materials depending upon the ecosystem, or you could randomly select any of the articles to any students. There is a corresponding worksheet if you would like to use that, the Reading to Learn, where they kind of pick the main purpose and fill out the graphic organizer. They are also going to write their organism on a Post-it or the whiteboard and determine what ecosystem it fits within. For example, a python would not necessarily fit well within a scrub ecosystem or an estuary ecosystem. We would typically see it in a swamp ecosystem. They're also going to determine if it is an invasive species or a keystone species. So hopefully through the article, they have determined, for an example, that a python is an invasive species. You can also do a carousel around the room and look at the response of other students and determine if their response is correct. Through the article, students will identify consequences that result from a reduction of biodiversity, such as ecological imbalance, reduced food sources and materials, and predict the impact of these changes on ecosystems. To wrap up our lesson, students are expected to create a Flipgrid. And through the Flipgrid, they're going to share the following information. This includes a specific example of a food chain within their ecosystem, description of each organism and what type of producer-consumer it is, explanation of what happens to the bulk of matter in any trophic level, identify potential consequences and impact of ecosystems, and have students refer to the following terms while scripting. So it might be best for some students to develop a script answering these questions prior to recording their Flipgrid. And they can do that on a Google Doc, on an extra sheet of paper, with all their pieces of evidence. There is also a teacher guide created on Flipgrid for some helpful hints, which also contains the rubric for how you will be grading students on their Flipgrid. I hope you guys enjoy the lesson. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out and have a great school year.